Hello, this is Dr. Schemberger, and in this talk, we will be focusing on speeches, news conferences, and meetings, the real, what I call the nuts and bolts of a journalist's job. News conferences, speeches, and meetings have to be covered. Unfortunately, these days, it seems that public meetings, are not being covered as often as they should. News conferences were still there, speeches, for the most part, were still there, but we seem to be lacking in meeting coverage. A lot of times that some of the information that we might get before a story, before a meeting rather, or before a news conference, as well as even what transpires after those events, those can be very important too. And we call those advanced stories or preliminary stories. And these types of stories help to tell the reader what's to come. So that way they can have some beginning context to all of this. With meeting coverage, we'll start here. This is where officials make decisions or they discuss issues and those affect the public. That's why we have to be there. Now, yes, meetings are going to be boring because they're going through the agenda and they're taking care of business. This is why we often see journalists from newspapers cover meetings. TV news stations generally do not show up, and the only time when they do show up at a meeting is if there is something controversial or something heated going on. That's about the only time because they know they can probably get some sort of good visual to go along with that, and of course it boosts their ratings as such. The public usually doesn't attend these meetings. Just over the decades, meeting attendance has not been important to a lot of people. But it's also because the public knows, or they feel like they can rely on the news media. They figure they're going to be at the meeting, they're going to cover what's happening, and then they're going to report about it. So the public, in that regard, really relies a lot on the news media. What happens though is when we don't cover meetings, then we're letting what I really consider kind of a philosophical aspect to this. We're letting democracy kind of slip through our fingers a little bit, to where we are in the dark. And we never want that to happen, not for us and not for our readers. So, not covering meetings is a huge mistake. Remember, the news media, we are watchdogs first. That's our first number one function. Yes, it's fun to do the feature stories. It's great to do event coverage, and we'll be talking some about that. But our first and foremost priority is being a watchdog. Now, as far as news conferences are concerned, or even speeches, those are good to cover. However, you have to understand, why are they holding this speech, or why are they holding this news conference? Many times they might be trying to further their own cause or maybe explain something in more detail. There's nothing wrong with covering these. I mean, they are news. It is a news development that we need to keep on top of. However, it's your job to be responsible by asking questions before the speech or the news conference, and asking questions after those events. And likewise, not just covering what the speaker says or what the public official says at the news conference, but we still have to get other points of view. So you still have to get all sides of the story. Now, when we are covering speeches, and it can be anything from like a commencement speech to maybe a political rally speech, any of those types of speeches, there still is some basic information that we need to obtain. We need to understand what the size of the audience is, especially if we have someone who is who carries some sort of notoriety. And if the audience is small, that might be something just to point out in the story. It's not the story itself, but it's just something to mention possibly. Where the speech is located, we got to let readers know where the speech was made, why the speech was made. Did something happen that caused the person want to give a speech, or was this person invited? So we just need to know why. Definitely some highlights from the speech, and those are quotations. Now, many times it is possible to get a copy of the speech from the speaker, maybe after the speech is given. However, don't ever rely on that. That's not always going to happen. Sometimes speakers don't want their speeches floating around in a text or paper version. But so that's why it's really important that you cover the speech and you still take notes and get the quotations. It's also kind of nice to note what the reaction of the audience is, especially if there are some dramatic points during the speech in which audience members might have some sort of reaction to that. But you have to be careful when noting that in the story because we don't want to make it look like we are adding in our viewpoints too much or editorializing or coloring the story. So sometimes it's just good just to note the reaction of the audience, but possibly you might not have to use that. It just depends. When we are covering speeches and we are writing the story, we are writing the news story as we would any other news story. So we don't want to clutter the top of our story with all the information about where the speech was made, why it was made. Again, sometimes we're not going to be able to fit all the 5 W's in that how and that so what all in one lead sentence. It might take 2 or 3 sentences for all that information to appear. When covering speeches and then writing the news stories, we can still have either a hard news lead or a soft news lead. It really does not matter. But either way, it has to have the same news approach that we apply to all news stories. So here's an example of a bad lead sentence. Veterans who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder spoke Monday to a psychology class about their lives and experiences. Well, first of all, really, what did they say? The fact that they spoke about that, that's not newsworthy. What was it in the speech? What was the main point in the speech? Or what was some sort of takeaway from the speech that you can hook readers on? In addition, to me, veterans, that's, is it 2 or 3? Or is there one particular veteran where we can kind of zone in on and make that the feature lead? So this lead was just way too generic. So we still have to practice those basic news skills in being able to find out what the main point that we can stress in a news lead. Many times when people speak in public, they're not always making their strongest points first, and they usually follow in chronological order. So your news story is not going to be written in the same order that speeches are. Speeches follow a different pattern. News stories still follow the same structure that we've always taught. Basically the inverted pyramid for the most part. But the most interesting information possibly isn't what happens during the speech. Sometimes it could be what happens after the speech or outside the place where the speech is made, especially if, for instance, one of the things I was always taught on the job that a news director taught me was that when you are covering a speech at the airport, um, what if the plane crashes after the person has left, especially during political campaign season? And when I used to do some meeting, or excuse me, when I used to cover speeches during that election time frame, I was told you always stay at the airport because you never know after takeoff if the plane could crash. That would become more of the story than the speech would. So actually, the speech would take more of the back door or the sidebar approach at that point. So, always be observing and just kind of stick around, get there early before the speech, just to kind of observe to see what happens, if anything, and then just stick around after the speaker is done. That way you can see if anything occurs. Now, you can use storytelling techniques in your news story, like narrative writing, descriptive writing. That's okay to do. Again, we just want to be able to still be objective. And like I mentioned earlier, don't expect a prepared copy of the speech. It might happen or it might not. So just always assume that you'll not be given a copy at all and that you'll just have to take notes. Now, shifting our focus to news conferences, they are similar to speeches in that speeches are being made. However, usually the questions that the reporters ask, those are going to be where I think a lot of the meat to the story will be. So those responses might be more important than the prepared comments that the speaker makes. So that's why it's really important to listen to what other reporters ask, because maybe they know a little bit more, or maybe there is a different angle that you you really capture, and you can be able to build your story on that. So that's why it's important when a news conference is called, research the issue. Why was it called? What's been going on to necessitate the news conference? And then also after the conference, really research it even more. That way you have more information. So at the news conference, you're not just reciting what took place. That's not what the purpose of our job is. We still have to make some sort of a news analysis for our readers, so that way they have a better grasp of what's going on. So when covering news conferences, some basic information that generally will be included in a story. The person or the group of people who are conducting the conference. Sometimes it can be public officials, sometimes it might be a nonprofit organization. Many different types of people and entities hold news conferences. The reason for the conference, so the background information is important. Some highlights, including responses to reporters' questions. The location, if relevant. I think it's always important to note where the news conference was held anyway, but if it was really an important place, for instance, I remember covering a case one time in which it became a murder case, and they held a news conference outside the house where it occurred. So, that might be important to note in the story. And then also reaction from other sources with who might have similar or opposing views. Many times those sources who have opposing views might not attend that news conference, and that's okay. So you still need to seek other views even after the conference, and even if those people do not attend the conference. You still have some work to do after the event. Kind of jumping back to stories about meetings. Meeting stories often are written without explaining the real impact on the reader. Sometimes people just say what happens in the meeting and that's it. So if City Council passes a payroll tax, what does that mean for the readers? What does that mean for many of them? Is it just for those who live in the city, or those who live in the county? Those who work in the city, or those who also work in the county? What does all this mean? Someone who makes $100,000 a year, how much in payroll tax are they going to pay based on the rate that was passed? So you have to be able to make those connections evident with the reader. The significance of the meeting to the reader, it really helps to make the story not so boring. Sometimes many reporters fall trapped to just writing a pure bureaucratic story that many people will not want to read. Again, you've got to find something that's going to be meaningful to the reader. In addition, whenever you are covering meetings, you've got to know the system a little bit. For instance, does a board of zoning have final authority? Usually, no. In some municipalities, boards of zoning are they might make some recommendations that are then forwarded to the city council, which then has the final authority. So you got to know how the governmental system in your community works. Some terms that you might need to know, for instance, advanced story. It's also known maybe as a pre-meeting story or just a preliminary story. And those are written in advance. So it's just knowing what is planned for a meeting. That sometimes is more important than what happens. Many times, about a week before a meeting, I will go ahead and call, for instance, the school board office and ask, do you have the meeting agenda set already? I'd like to see a copy of it if possible. Sometimes it's ready, sometimes it's not, but if I can go ahead and look and to see what major topics are up for discussion or approval, then those might be part of my advanced story. When covering the meeting, you're going to arrive early. How early? I like to get to meetings, truthfully, and this is just me, but I like to get there about 20 minutes early. But I think really 10 to 15 minutes is sufficient. And the reason why you want to arrive early, first of all, you want to be able to get a decent seat so you can hear what's going on and you can see things. You also want to talk to people. Sometimes you might pick up one or two story ideas just from others. And that's really one of the best things about being there early, is to be able to see what's going on in other people's lives that could be newsworthy. You also want to look at the agenda again, even though you might have an advanced copy, but sometimes things get added to the agenda. So you always want to just do another double take on the agenda to see if anything's sneaked up on you. You also want to look at what's called the consent agenda. Consent agenda is that occurs when certain measures are grouped together because they're pretty routine. That can be financial reports, things along those lines, maybe committee reports. Just however, again, it's knowing the structure. So it's however the organization wants to arrange that consent agenda. But all of those are just grouped into one, and then the board will just do one vote on it. In addition, you want to stay until the end of the meeting. I've often seen, especially TV journalists, who go to the meetings just to get what they want and then they leave. That's a no-no. For one thing, it's just rude. Second of all, you really just need to stay until the end. You never know what can happen in those meetings. So you've got to stay until the end of the meeting. In writing the meeting story, never start your story. That news lead had not better be saying that the city council met and discussed several things. That is so boring. It does nothing for the reader. In fact, it's an injustice to the reader. So make sure that you find something that occurred in that meeting that's going to be meaningful to the reader. So your news lead is going to still maybe include when the meeting was held, but really the significance, the so what. That's what you've got to have in that news lead. Some other points to remember when covering meetings, news conferences, or speeches. We got to do a lot more listening than I think we do now. And but we also need to be able to do more than listen and repeat. So we've got to do a lot of listening, but we've got to do more than just listen and then repeat what we hear. And I think that's what happens a lot when we're covering these things. We only just write up a news story based on that one news conference that we attended. This is what was said, and that was it. We got to dig a little bit deeper. We got to travel a little bit farther. So we have to do a more balanced story, more contextual than what's out there now. We also need to ask good questions. How do we get good questions? It's all based on our research. That's why the research before you cover any of this stuff, as well as the research you do after, that helps us to ask good questions. When covering any of these events, you always want to get full quotations of the important points. Again, jot down any reactions that the speaker might make while making those comments, as well as those from the audience. And I always like to put this in here, get an aisle seat. So you're probably thinking, why would I do that? An aisle seat, that way, if you think about it, and really it'd be an aisle seat in which you have great access to be able to get up quickly. I'm one of those, I like the aisle seats because when the meeting's done, then I can go on up and get my questions answered. I can go talk to other people. But even during the meeting, let's say somebody makes a presentation and then has to leave. Well, I want to be able to talk to that person quickly, or at least get their phone number, and maybe I can call them later. So I am out the door quickly to catch that person, and then I can come on back into the meeting. That aisle seat is just really important. It just gives you more room to be able to move quickly, to reach people quickly if necessary. And that concludes this talk about speeches, news conferences, and meetings. Thank you for your attention.